Hello, Read 585, and welcome to part two. We are focused on talking about response to intervention this week. So let's get down to the nitty gritty. So, likely you have heard of RTI prior to this course within the program. At least that's my hope, is that you've been exposed to the notion of RTI. But how it differs for our purposes in this class is that you are really going to now be applying the idea of response to intervention and having a tiered framework to your case study to create, a similar structure framework that's going to improve the learning of all students in that school's context. So that is our objective for this week, to be able to apply the principles of RTI to create an environment and a structure where all students achieve. So you're going to be using our content from this week in order to produce a plan for intervention in assignment 2, part 3. A brief background of RTI, which I think you should know by now, is that prior to 2004, the way we determined if a student had a learning difficulty is we looked at a discrepancy between IQ tests and their performance in the classroom. And if there was a mismatch, then it was likely there was some sort of learning deficit there. And so our solution was refer the student to special education. Well, now, with No Child Left Behind and the reauthorization of the IDEA, we now determine learning difficulties by looking how students respond to scientific research-based intervention. So as we know, the teacher is an integral component in a child's education, and poor quality instruction can lead to, poor student achievement. So in order to take that factor out of the equation, we need to ensure that students are getting the best instruction for them. And if not, we need to provide them some sort of intervention that will meet their needs, and then evaluate the progress they make, and then, try another round possibly of using another research-based intervention, basically trying several rounds of intervention to see if they can then respond. And over time, if not, if they aren't able to make progress after you've tried many different strategies with them directed toward their individual learning needs, then maybe we need to look into, is there a learning disability? So this is more of a problem-solving process that looks at the match between the current instruction happening and whether or not it's meeting student needs. And then how can we adjust that instruction to better meet the needs, and how is the student then responding? So a much better approach, and one that I've found to be very successful. There are some foundational beliefs of RTI. The first one is that all children can learn, and it is our responsibility to identify the instructional and environmental conditions that enable learning. So the idea of, the self-fulfilling prophecy, if you don't have high expectations, you don't think they can achieve it, they're not going to rise to meet your expectations. So we need to have high expectations of students. We need to believe that they all can learn, and we can. And it is our responsibility to find the optimal conditions under which they can learn. In your chapter 9 of the text, there's an interesting discussion and a term that was newer to me that I wanted to highlight, and it's on page 180, where it talks about Anne Duffy, who's a literacy coach for a number of years and researcher, and she gave us the definition of what she called literacy acceleration, and that's basically the idea of, accelerating reading and writing for struggling readers. And so she did a summer intervention and reflected on its success to determine, what in fact made it successful, and found that really it wasn't just her knowledge. She had a lot of ideas and strategies as a literacy coach, but her belief that the success of the children was her responsibility. It's not the student's responsibility. It's not the family's responsibility, but it is her responsibility to, have the best possible instruction to meet the student's needs. So knowledge plus beliefs are important, and that's how she came up with this idea of instructional responsibility. It is all of our responsibility as staff at this school to meet all of our students' needs, and that really supports the idea of RTI. The second foundational belief is that early intervention, even as early as preschool, is key to addressing concerns as they arise before problems go. And this chapter gives you a lot of great research to support the fact that early intervention is key. And in fact, this quote on page 177 encapsulates that. The authors say that the most efficient and effective time to prevent reading failure is right at the start of formal reading instruction, when the achievement gap between normally developing and low-performing readers is the smallest. As we read about in the secondary setting article, RTI in the content area setting, if they are significantly behind by the time they get to that level, there's just so much more that the students need. And it's really hard for those teachers to teach their content as well as teach foundational reading skills. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. So that's why we need to catch it when the gap is the smallest, to fill it right away so that it doesn't, perpetuate year after year. So quick, down and dirty, RTI is a general education-led effort. This is a misconception that it's, the fast track to special education. It's general ed led, but 15% of SPED funding can be used for it, which is nice. It is a model of prevention. So we are, identifying students early that may need intervention, and we're really providing them with, scientific research-based interventions. So again, not a special education placement, not a model of failure. It is that problem-solving process that focuses on optimizing instruction. It's not a system for identifying what is wrong with the student or a specific program or model. In fact, the federal government purposefully provided few details. There is flexibility, which is great because we know that something like this needs to be driven by the context within which it lives. So, on the one hand, that makes it difficult because just, tell me how to implement this at my school. Just tell me what RTI is and what it looks like. Well, if there's no set model, it's kind of overwhelming to create one if you don't have, the skill set and knowledge to do that. But then on the other hand, it's nice that they recognize that there isn't one model that works at all schools. It's really context driven based on your student population, what their needs are, what your schedule can allow for, what your personnel can allow for. It is context embedded the way that any plan should be. So what is RTI? Stands for response to intervention. It's systematic, it's data-driven, it's an approach to instruction that benefits every student. You can also think of it as response to instruction. So when we see that students are not responding to our instruction, we are not effective with that learner, we are doing something about it right away. Response to intervention can be applied to academics, not just reading even, can also be applied to mathematics or other content areas. And then it can even be done for behavior. So if you're having some chronic behavior problem students, where your current behavior management system is not effective, maybe you need to design a tier 2, framework or structure of support to give them so that they can be more successful. And then you progress monitor their behavior and see if that was effective or not, and then maybe change it. So that is something that I've helped to institute as well, RTI for behavior. The goal is prevention. I've said this before. And then I want to draw your attention to the fact that there are 2 different models typically found for RTI. These are talked about on page 181. The first is a problem-solving model, which is, works better when there are less students to discuss, because what happens is the classroom teacher, a group of specialists, they meet and discuss the needs of each student. And they brainstorm strategies and systems for that student and monitoring their progress. So it's very customized and individualized by student, and they go through each student one at a time. So probably easier to implement when number of students is small versus the standard protocol. You kind of have your cut scores. If a student performs at this level on this assessment, then they're going to be receiving this tier 2 intervention, which is going to consist of this. So it's less customized by student need, but it is easier to implement for a large scale of students. But then the challenge for the interventionist is to say, okay, even though, this is the uniform intervention for tier 2, phonics intervention or tier 2 fluency intervention, how am I going to adapt it? Because I know that within my group of students in front of me, I still need to address different needs. In a sentence or two, and this is really long, it's taken from page 1 of the IRA statement, but RTI is comprehensive, systematic approach to teaching and learning. It addresses language and literacy problems for all students through increasingly differentiated and intensified language and literacy assessment and instruction. And that is the big thing, is how is the curriculum integrating assessment and instruction, and how are we looking at assessment to drive instruction, and then looking at instruction to plan assessments, and just back and forth. Qualified professionals, so experts in the field of literacy with appropriate expertise, should be providing this instruction. As such, RTI is a process that cuts across general, compensatory, and special education. It's not exclusively Gen or SPED initiative. The Commission takes the position that carefully selected assessment, so here are some of the critical components, dedicated to differentiated instruction, quality professional development, and genuine collaboration across, all the constituents is important. So when you do create your plan for assignment 2, making sure that within it, you have a plan for assessment. You have then, because the assessment data has shown such, here's what we're going to do now. What's our differentiated instruction, which can be happening at the tier 1 level in the classroom, can be happening with additional tiers and levels of support. And then what staff development needs to be occurring so that both of these pieces are effective? Do teachers know how to give the assessment? Do they know how to analyze and interpret the data? Do they know how to take the data and then plan based off of the data? Do they know how to differentiate? Differentiation includes making changes to the work product, the process that the student follows, or the environment. So our teachers, adept at differentiating. So looking at the PD that's needed for teachers to be able to implement, and then how do we build collaboration across each of, these levels, which is often a pitfall of RTI, is that, the pullout teacher does one thing, the classroom teacher does another thing. There's no communication there. So how can you embed more open communication, dialogue, collaboration between each of these people? And then parents, how are parents being involved in this process? Lots to think about as you apply these important principles to your case study. And that's what I'm going to be looking for, is assessment, differentiation, professional learning, collaboration. So IRA position statement outlines 6 guiding principles, and you can read about each of these in depth. I will just quickly highlight them and give you my 2 cents. So first guiding principle is instruction. First and foremost, we need the best instruction possible to prevent problems. And so I know I've shared before that when I was a literacy specialist and was charged with the task of implementing RTI, I was hired to open a school as the literacy specialist, and my principal was fabulous. She gave me a ton of autonomy and said, you can define your role, you can make your schedule, do what you need to do, but you need to implement RTI and it needs to be effective and we need to see student growth. Here's a binder of articles that are all about RTI. You need to read them. You need to be the site-based RTI expert, and you need to figure this out. So for me, in a brand new school with a lot of new teachers that I wasn't familiar with, it started by looking at the instruction currently happening in the classroom. And since we had so many students coming to our school that were significantly behind grade level, I couldn't possibly see everyone that I needed to see and pull out, nor has pull out, been proven to be the most effective way possible to do this. So how do we optimize learning in the classroom? Tier 1. How can students integrate more small group instruction? How can they differentiate more? How can they target student needs? How can they be aware of student needs? What are their assessment practices like? Yada, yada, yada. Instruction, very important. Number 2 is responsive teaching and differentiation. So, how are teachers differentiating in the classroom? What does that look like? So, when they give an assessment and they see the results, what are they doing with those results? Are they just pushing forward? Are they finding creative ways to go back and fill those gaps before moving on? This also talks about the need to intensify instruction as well as part of differentiation, which is key with tiered instruction. The second tier is a little bit more intensive, as is the third tier. So ways to intensify instruction are smaller group sizes, more amount of time, more highly focused, those kinds of things. Assessment, which is probably the third time I've mentioned the word of assessment, but this really goes hand in hand with increasing your effectiveness as an instructor. You need a measure to show that you're effective, and then if not, you need to do something about it, and then you need to monitor that what you attempted to do about it was truly effective. So assessment, instruction. Collaboration, I mentioned that with that statement on page 1, but really making sure there are dynamic, positive, and productive collaborative relationships happening with the professionals in your building, as well as with the families. And, a note about collaboration is a big constraint of this is time. When do we have time to just sit around and talk about, how to collaborate more? You need to build that time into your schedule for teachers to have those conversations, because if left to their own devices, they have so many other things to do that it's hard for them to make the time for this. But it really is so important, to be able to have multiple educators who work with that student, all focusing on the same things and knowing, what are the specific goals for that student. 5th is systemic and comprehensive approaches. And really what this means is the integration of instruction with assessment, basically. Like you've created a system for how you're going to approach RTI and assessment and instruction. And it's comprehensive and it takes into account all of these things that are important. And then lastly is teacher expertise. Obviously, to have the best instruction possible, you need to be building teacher capacity and teacher expertise, which is why that professional learning, as stated on the previous slide, is so important to support the work of RTI. And that's why it's a component of your plan. So here's an RTI model taken from the RTI Network website, just to give you a visual. Hopefully you've seen a triangle like this before, but it reminds us, here at Tier 1 is all students. This is where students are, being seen in the classroom by their classroom teacher. And let's say that Tier 1 instruction is not effective, then we can provide some supplemental interventions, which really should only be this is 10 to 20% of special education students, whereas this might be more like 80 to 90% of the special education students. But this would be like, 15 to 20% maybe. That's even a little high. Maybe 10 to 15% of your overall student population. I mean, it depends on how many you have the capacity to serve. And then here would be only like 5% of your student population. So even higher risk students get even more intensive instruction there at the Tier 3 level. So you can kind of read more about this on the RTI Network website, and they do a better job of kind of distinguishing between these two levels, as well as how special education falls within them. So this is something that I adapted from a training I went to that I shared with staff when I was presenting with them, here is our plan for RTI. An overview of each of the tiers. So the goal at tier 1 is to prevent failure and optimize learning through whole class instruction, but there's still differentiation even though it's, whole class instruction. There's still small group work happening. So this is intended for all students, the classroom teachers, the interventionist. It's happening in the gen ed setting. There is grouping happening. It's flexible based off of assessment results, minimum of 90 minutes a day. Benchmark assessments are happening at the beginning, middle, and end of the year, and I'll talk a little bit more about the different types of benchmark assessments. Tier 2 is that more intensive support for students that we are identifying as falling behind their same grade peers. We want to catch them right away. So they haven't been responding well to the instruction happening in tier 1. So the teacher can provide tier 2 support, a literacy specialist or resource specialist, but they should be a highly effective, well-trained person. Could be push-in, could be pull-out. It should be homogeneous small group instruction, 4 to 5 students. Should be about 30 minutes a day, 4 days a week. In addition to this effective instruction, they should be progress monitored about twice a month on the target scale, which is the focus of their intervention, to ensure adequate progress and learning. And then lastly, in tier 3, this is even more focused, individualized instruction for those high need students. And this is after they haven't been effective in tier 2 or tier 1. Similar things here, however, you see the intensity increase as the group size gets smaller, the duration of time gets longer, and the progress monitoring is more frequent. The best interventions are found to be active, aggressive, and provided at the onset of the problem. So as soon as we notice that someone is not meeting grade level expectations, we are having a plan for that student. It provides additional modeling, support, feedback, and practice within a specific domain. So it really should be targeted on what that student needs. And they're going to need, more direct instruction, but also more time to apply that and receive corrective feedback on how they're doing with that. It's targeted to a specific area of need with a highly structured lesson plan, which can be a challenge for upper elementary because of the fact that, they have so much they're already trying to teach, and by the time students get to this level, they have so many needs. How do you prioritize what is most important? So you really have to think about what's the biggest issue holding the student back. That's going to be your targeted student need, and that's what your lesson plan is going to be focused on. And we're doing a lot of work on this right now in 581. So if you're worried about what does this look like, don't worry, 581 is coming to you very soon, and this is all we do, targeted intervention for 10 weeks. All right, it's intensive. There is no time wasted, and it can be done individually or within small group. One of my biggest pet peeves is when the interventionist goes to the, one second grade classroom and picks up 3 kids, and then goes to the next second grade classroom and gets 1 kid, and then goes to the next second grade classroom to get another kid, and then they walk all the way to the interventions room, which is like, in a closet on the second floor in the farthest corner from where second grade is. And it's like, how much time is being spent collecting these kids? That's a huge waste of time. So really think about your time utilization and being strategic with your transitions. Can you meet the second graders in the hallway right by one of their doors? Can you, if you have second grade groups back to back, can you send one group out with a note card they give to the teacher that says, I now need so-and-so, 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 and then the teacher reads that note card, and then those kids, meet you wherever your meeting place is? Or what can you do to prevent loss of time wherever it is happening? Speaking of time, there's a specific notion of time during the lesson. So, things move at rapid pace. We're not just wasting time cutting things out, gluing things down. No, we don't Ain't nobody got time for that. So how can you utilize time-saving procedures so that you're not wasting time within your intervention session or across days and weeks? Next, a specialized teacher should be teaching this using even more systematic materials that are specifically designed for that target area of need. It should be interactive. I know for 581, our course texts say that students should be engaged in reading for at least a third of the time of the intervention. So it's not you talking at them or doing, phonics worksheets the whole time. They need to spend a third of the time actually reading, as well as writing, discussing, and manipulating. Interactive sessions. And ultimately, it should be instruction that permits literacy acceleration. All right, and assessment in RTI, what teachers and specialists need to know. There are multiple purposes for assessment. We had a whole week focused on assessment, so I just want to remind you that there are screening assessments that need to happen at the start of the school year, or maybe you do your screening at the end of the school year, which I've seen some schools do, but then how do you, factor in summer reading loss, and then new students are coming anyway, other students are leaving, so it's just best to do your screening at the beginning of the year. From there, you can determine which students need diagnostic assessments. So, specific assessments on phonics or fluency or comprehension, whatever it may be. You have formative progress monitoring, which could be things like classroom-based measures that tell you, was my instruction effective, and then how can I change that? How can I inform my instruction based on results? Pre-tests are a great way to do formative progress monitoring too. So using how the students did on, if you design an assessment that covers the objectives in that unit, and then I did this more with math, but you can look at how they did, and you can then make your pacing for that unit based off of their performance on the pretest. So maybe they already know how to do one of the objectives. You can truncate how much time you're spending on that and then really spend your time on what it is that they need. So pre-assessment is a great way to do the formative assessment process. Benchmark progress monitoring. A good time to do that is the middle of the year. Give another, whatever your screening tool was, you can give that again. A lot of people are DIBEL schools, they give DIBELs at the beginning, middle, end of year. Well, that mid-year one is really your benchmark progress monitoring. It's given to all students, and it's making sure that everyone's making the progress they need. If not, then you might need to make some changes to who is in what tiers of intervention. And then lastly, you have your summative outcome assessment that tells you overall results from the year. How were we? Or it could be you have a summative outcome assessment from your unit. So here are some samples. You can take a look at this. I kind of talked about these as I introduced you to the 5 different types. Here is a sample RTI implementation timeline that I utilized. So in September, at the start of the school, we administered DIBELs and the developmental reading assessment, which was a measure of oral reading fluency and comprehension. So these were our screeners. Teachers submitted their reading data to me, and I analyzed the results. Then from these results, we determined who needed additional supports, and then we started our Tier 2 interventions. We progress monitored them, and then teachers again assessed students on their reading levels and submitted their monthly reading data to me. So that the first week of each month, I was having a collaboration meeting with teachers where we looked at this data. We talked about who is not making the needed progress, how can they be targeted in the classroom by the teacher, and we even picked out Tier 1 focused students and came up with specific intervention ideas for them, little checklists, and then, we talked about the students in Tier 2 and Tier 3, and what I was doing, what the teacher was saying. This is the embedded collaboration. So during their prep, the first week of the month, all we did was the reflection meetings. Interventions continued, we progress monitored, submitted the data, and then here we are doing reflection meetings again, but here we gave our, screener again, which we treated as our, benchmark assessment as well to see who, now these kids that were not progress monitoring weekly or bi-weekly, how are they doing? And then got some feedback from teachers on RTI. Bottom line, you need a plan. You're making it for part 3 of assignment 2, and hopefully you get to go and implement this plan. Things to keep into consideration are the places. So, places being the different tiers and, where the different interventions are happening geographically within your school, the times, when are students receiving these interventions. They obviously can't miss lunch. We don't want them missing specials. We don't want them missing grade level instruction either. So, is there a reading or a writing workshop happening during the teacher's day? We talked a lot about this when we talked about scheduling, block scheduling it out too. So different grades have their literacy workshop at different times, and that could be when the specialist does push in. Groupings, how are students grouped so that it optimizes learning for students with a common need. And then personnel, how is personnel going to be utilized most effectively for the interventions? All right, we're at the 30-minute mark, and I just want to wrap up a little bit about this content area article that you may opt to read this week. You haven't had lecture from me for a little bit, so I'll make up for it this week. So RTI for content area teachers looks very different because they're not just focused on teaching foundational reading skills or teaching how to learn to read or read to learn. In fact, they're really teaching content. So, we can't expect them to teach basic reading skills, but they can help students develop the knowledge, reading strategies, and thinking skills to understand and learn from increasingly complex texts in their content areas. So if students cannot access the content, then that falls on the content area teachers to make sure that they can and to provide supports and interventions for them to be successful. So what RTI means for content areas, there are 3 purposes. 1, to build capacity to meet graduation standards, to make students more proficient, to increase achievement. 2, to ensure appropriate instruction and intervention. So, if what you're doing isn't currently effective, you need to, again, take instructional responsibility and do something about it now. You need to optimize your instruction. And 3, to provide a system of continuous school improvement. So, the better your instruction is getting whole school, the less students you're going to have to catch up. I mean, ideally, you wouldn't have students in the secondary level who needed this kind of support, but that isn't the reality. So none of these goals can be met without a change in the way literacy is taught in content area classrooms. If content teachers fail to offer responsive literacy instruction to benefit every student and differentiated assistance for those in need of extra help, then the preventative potential of RTI is lost. So RTI still needs to be happening in the upper grade levels. It just looks very different. So how does Tier 1 look? Well, subject area teachers who are experts in their disciplinary, they need to guide and model and provide opportunities for students to try out the steps in the ways of thinking that are appropriate to that discipline. So they need to invite students to become learners in their specific discipline. They need to provide discipline-specific strategy instruction. They need to also provide increased opportunities to read. Everyone needs to provide as much time with text as possible. If students, can't access that text, they need to differentiate the reading materials, and they still should be giving literacy assessment to ensure that students can, in fact, access that text and to what level, and are they applying the discipline, specific strategies needed for that level of text. So researchers began identifying how literacy is used in the disciplines, and it suggested that there are several reading and thinking strategies that are used across the disciplines, like prior knowledge, specialized vocabulary building, learning to deconstruct complex sentences, using knowledge of text structures and genres, mapping graphic and mathematical representations, posing discipline-relevant questions, comparing claims and propositions across text, and evaluating claims. These are things that can be done in all discipline areas to teach students to model and guide and instruct and provide them practice time with being a better, more proficient reader. So how do you differentiate? It comes down to your text selection a lot at the upper level there. So, you can provide more challenging text with, some explanation of it if you have students who, need to be pushed more even. Making sure texts are at the zone of proximal development, and even bringing in easy text that builds self-efficacy. You want to make sure you have a balanced diet of all of these things, not just dense, dry reading. And you want to have text tailored to develop that particular reading component. So, going back to some of these skills that are, helpful in all disciplines, if you're looking at text structures and genres or mapping graphic representations, you need to make sure that's represented in the text you're using, obviously. Tier 2. There are 3 different types of Tier 2 intervention. One is using a purchase program. Another is addressing individual reading needs. And then the third is strategy instruction. So as you can guess, a purchase program is not going to meet the needs of very many students because it wasn't developed with your specific student group in mind. Addressing individual reading needs is very difficult when you have how many students. You don't just have your self-contained class of 20 to 30 kids, but you have how many periods of how many different kids. That's just really difficult to manage. So the goal here is really going to be strategy instruction. That's going to be the biggest bang for your buck. So this talks about how, some schools have instituted general reading classes, so that's more of here's our purchase program of how to teach reading for middle school and high schoolers with low reading scores. But these are very much a one-size-fits-all approach, and they're often focused on very low-level skills that are not needed. So instead, strategy instruction as an intervention has been found to be very effective. So teaching specific vocabulary and comprehension strategies produces achievement. In a synthesis of intervention studies conducted between 1994 and 2004, students in grades 6 through 12, strong evidence for teaching of comprehension. However, they do give you the caveat that you can teach strategy instruction until you're blue in the face, but if you teach it in isolation without a chance to apply it, then students' needs will not be met. So when doing strategy instruction, remember that principle of making your instruction interactive. Students are doing the reading and the thinking and the discussing and the manipulating and the processing, okay? All right, here's some resources for RTI. This RTI from All Sides is kind of more of your primer of RTI, the basics really, quick, easy read. This is a little more academic, successful approaches to RTI. It's, best practices for K-12 literacy. So it'll give you a chapter, highlighting a specific aspect of RTI, and then the following chapter will give you a case study of a school that's actually done that, and it does span all levels, K-12. So, I learned a lot from this. It's very academic, high level, whereas this is more applicable, more teacher-friendly, a little more palatable. Here's some websites: RTI Action Network, National Center on Response to Intervention. My favorite is Vanderbilt University's IRIS Center. They have module after module that you could use at a teacher training or development. They have so many tools and different things for you. Great, great website. All right, as a reminder, here's what you're reading. Lots of great stuff. Here's what we're working on, and here is a quote to launch you, which says, "No one has the right to waste a day in the life of a child." And that just reiterates the idea of you have instructional responsibility for these students. all of the personnel at your site has instructional responsibility for these students. So you need to do whatever it takes and not blame the child, not blame the child's family. Make sure that you truly believe that all students can learn, because if not, you might not be in the right profession. So, evaluate your belief system, do a mindset change, even if you're, struggling with a particular student, mindset shift, and really believe that you can make the difference, because you can. So much research on teachers being, the number one factor in student achievement. So, all right, go out there and have a great day. Make it a great day for your students. And I will see you next week when we totally switch gears and talk about writing for publication and grant writing. All right, have a great week.